Do you think the worst thing on your birthday is everyone forgetting it? Wrong. The absolute worst is when the people you love most hand you a gift wrapped in pure betrayal. At 45, I built an empire from nothing, creating a perfect sanctuary for my family. Yet, as my only son smiled and handed me an eviction notice right across the dinner table, he had no idea the real prey on the chopping block was not me. Hello, dear listeners of James' Revenge Stories, and thank you for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with absolutely no budget to maintain our daily operations. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just a $1 donation so we can pay our dedicated staff, helping them cover their living expenses and allowing us to keep producing these revenge stories for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or by clicking the PayPal link down in the description or the comments section. My name is Sophie Grant, and this is exactly how my 45th birthday unfolded. I woke up on the morning of my 45th birthday to the familiar crisp scent of blue spruce and crushed lavender drifting through the open window of my bedroom. The morning sun painted soft, deliberate strokes of gold across the reclaimed hardwood floors of Cedar and Sage Estate. Located deep in the breathtaking heart of Silver Pine Valley, Colorado, this property was far more than just a home to me. Over the past 15 years, I had poured every ounce of my blood, sweat, and tears into the rich soil of this land, transforming a forgotten patch of mountain wilderness into a multi-million-dollar organic farm and a state-of-the-art cosmetics laboratory. It was my sanctuary, my life's work, and my ultimate legacy. My son, Derek, who had recently turned 24, and his fiancée, Chloe, had arrived late Friday evening. Their stated intention was to prepare a weekend-long surprise birthday celebration for me. As a single mother who had sacrificed everything to build a secure future for her child, the thought of my boy taking the time to celebrate my milestone should have filled my heart with overwhelming warmth. Instead, a strange, suffocating chill had settled over the house the moment they stepped through the heavy oak front doors. The subtle, grounding scent of my blooming sage was suddenly competing with Chloe's heavy, synthetic designer perfume. But it was not just the smell that felt incredibly wrong. The organic beauty of the estate felt suddenly entirely at odds with the stifling, awkward energy radiating from my guests. Yesterday, when I walked down the driveway to fetch the morning mail, I realized the main security code for the front gate had been completely wiped and changed. When I calmly asked about it, Chloe offered an overly sweet, rehearsed smile and brushed it off as a temporary security upgrade for the catering vendors she claimed to have hired. Then I noticed the living room. The cozy, inviting space I had meticulously decorated with hand-woven blankets and warm, earthy tones had been systematically stripped of its soul. The plush, comforting rugs were rolled up and stored away. The cherished family photos were pushed to the dark edges of the mantelpiece, and the armchairs were repositioned into a stiff, symmetrical layout that closely resembled a sterile corporate waiting room. The warmth of a family home had been replaced by the cold, sharp efficiency of an executive office. Even more unsettling were the hushed, frantic phone conversations. At least 3 times before noon, I caught Chloe pacing on the back stone patio, her voice dropping to a sharp, commanding whisper as she spoke to someone she explicitly referred to as the appraisal representative. In my experience, people planning a simple birthday party do not usually require the services of property appraisers. But the most glaring, heartbreaking red flag of all was Derek. My vibrant, energetic boy seemed to have shrunk into his own skin. Every single time I entered a room, his broad shoulders tensed. He actively avoided my gaze, choosing instead to stare intensely at his leather shoes or the porcelain rim of his coffee mug. Whenever I asked him a simple question, like what time the supposed guests were arriving, his hand would immediately shoot up to rub the back of his neck. It was a nervous tic he had carried since he was a little boy, trying to hide a broken vase from me. Worse yet, before he would even open his mouth to answer my questions, his eyes would instinctively dart toward Chloe, silently seeking her permission or waiting for her to feed him the correct script. Chloe, on the other hand, was entirely too comfortable. She glided through my kitchen as if she already held the deed to the property in her perfectly manicured hands. As she poured me a cup of black coffee, she leaned heavily against the marble counter and sighed, putting on a mask of deep, manufactured concern. "You know, Sophie, you have been pushing yourself far too hard lately," Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "Ever since that minor car accident last year, you just have not been the same. It takes a massive toll on a person." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, feeling the bitter liquid burn pleasantly down my throat. "I am perfectly fine, Chloe. It was just a minor fender bender." "Still," she pressed on, placing a cold hand over mine, "running a massive estate and a laboratory is a young person's game. You have done incredibly well for yourself, but it is time to rest. You really need to start thinking about stepping back and enjoying your middle age peacefully. Let the next generation handle the heavy lifting." She smiled, but her eyes were completely devoid of any real warmth. They were the calculating eyes of a predator circling a wounded animal. I did not pull my hand away, nor did I argue or defend my vitality. As a woman who had successfully navigated the brutal, shark-infested waters of the corporate business world for nearly 2 decades, my intuition was screaming at a deafening pitch. Every instinct I possessed told me that a meticulously crafted, malicious plot was weaving its way through the very walls of my home. My own son was clearly complicit, completely bound by the strings of his ambitious, ruthless fiancée. Yet I remained perfectly still. I smiled back at Chloe, nodding slowly as if I was deeply absorbing her profound wisdom. I knew the absolute best way to catch a snake was to let it believe it was completely hidden in the tall grass. I decided to maintain absolute silence, anchoring myself in my business acumen, waiting patiently to see exactly how far this theatrical performance would go, and what kind of poison they were preparing to serve me at my own birthday dinner. The evening shadows lengthened outside the tall dining room windows, swallowing the golden light that had previously warmed the space. Dinner was an agonizingly quiet, suffocating affair. The gentle clanking of heavy silver forks against fine porcelain china echoed like gunshots in the vast, stifling silence of the room. I had prepared a beautiful roasted pheasant with a delicate wild plum glaze, an old family favorite, but the food tasted like dry ash in my mouth. Derek barely touched his plate. He sat rigidly, his eyes glued to the half-empty water glass in front of him, chewing aggressively on the inside of his cheek. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked rhythmically, counting down to an inevitable explosion. Suddenly, the sharp pop of a cork shattered the heavy atmosphere. Chloe stood at the head of the table, holding a bottle of vintage champagne she had brought from the city. The sparkling liquid cascaded into 3 tall crystal flutes with a mocking, festive hiss. She raised her glass high, the flickering candlelight catching the icy, calculating gleam in her eyes. "To Sophie," Chloe announced, her voice ringing out with a polished, theatrical cheerfulness that felt entirely manufactured. "A woman who has worked tirelessly, perhaps far too tirelessly, for several decades. Tonight we celebrate not just your 45th birthday, but the glorious dawn of new beginnings. Cheers to stepping down, letting go, and finally embracing the quiet, restful life you so deeply deserve." The toast hung in the air, heavy and loaded with unspoken threats. Derek slowly reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. His face was entirely drained of color, resembling a pale ghost rather than my vibrant sun. His hand trembled visibly as he pulled out a luxurious deep red velvet box. It was perfectly rectangular and thick, the exact kind of box that usually held a delicate pearl necklace or a heavy diamond bracelet. He placed it onto the polished mahogany table and pushed it slowly toward me. The friction of the velvet against the wood produced a soft, grating whisper that set my teeth on edge. "Happy birthday, Mom," Derek muttered. His voice was completely hollow, stripped of any genuine affection, sounding dry and forced like a poorly rehearsed line in a terrible stage play. I did not reach for it immediately. I stared at the red velvet, then at my son, and finally at Chloe, who was taking a long, deliberate sip of her champagne, watching me over the rim of her glass with intense, predatory anticipation. Slowly, I extended my hands and unlatched the tiny golden clasp. The spring mechanism clicked sharply, and the lid fell back. There was no jewelry inside. There was no heartfelt greeting card expressing a son's gratitude. Instead, tucked neatly into the custom-cut velvet lining, lay a thick stack of tightly folded, heavily stamped legal documents. I pulled the papers out and smoothed them flat over the table. The bold black ink of the header screamed up at me. The harsh typography read, "Eviction Notice and Asset Liquidation." The air was instantly sucked out of the room. A suffocating dead silence crashed down upon us, so heavy it felt like the atmospheric pressure in the room had suddenly doubled. I did not gasp. I did not cry out. I simply kept my eyes locked on those heavy, damning words, my mind racing to process the sheer audacity of the paper resting under my fingertips. The sound of a dining chair scraping aggressively against the floorboards broke the quiet. Chloe dropped the sweet, caring future daughter-in-law facade in a fraction of a second. She stood up tall, crossing her arms firmly over her chest. Her posture shifted dramatically. The relaxed, breezy houseguest vanished, replaced entirely by a ruthless corporate shark. Her jaw set firmly, her shoulders squared, and her tone turned sharp, cold, and strictly business. "Let me save you the trouble of reading through the exhausting legal jargon," Chloe stated, her voice slicing through the tension like a newly sharpened blade. "Nexterra Innovations has officially acquired the entirety of Cedar and Sage Estate. As the Senior Project Manager of the Regional Development Division, I am here to personally deliver this notice on behalf of the board. The land, the laboratory, the agricultural facilities, absolutely everything belongs to the corporation now." I ignored her completely. My gaze shifted slowly, locking onto the young man sitting across from me. My son. The boy I had protected from every storm. The child whose future I had sacrificed my own youth to secure. "How?" I asked. The word was incredibly quiet, almost a whisper, but it commanded the absolute attention of the room. "How exactly did you manage to sell property that you do not own, Derek?" Derek flinched violently, as if I had physically struck him across the face. He refused to look at me, his chin buried deep into his chest. When he finally spoke, his words stumbled out in a rushed, pathetic stream. "Last year," he stammered, his knuckles turning stark white as he gripped the edge of the dining table. "When you had the car accident, when you were in the coma for those 4 days, the doctors said you might not wake up. They said I needed to be prepared for the absolute worst. I used the emergency medical and financial power of attorney you signed for me. I transferred the primary deeds of the land and the operating company into my name. It was supposed to be a precaution to protect the estate from going into probate. But then Chloe showed me the projection models. I realized we were sitting on an absolute gold mine. So I finalized the sale to Nexterra. He had stolen my life's work while I was lying in a hospital bed hooked up to life support. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. The very legal document I had created to protect him had been weaponized to execute me. Chloe scoffed loudly, stepping closer to the table, her high heels clicking sharply against the floor. She smirked, a cruel, triumphant expression twisting her perfectly made-up features. "Do not look at him like he is some kind of monster, Sophie," she sneered, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "He made a brilliant executive decision. We are giving you a very generous grace period of exactly 30 days to pack up your personal belongings and vacate the premises entirely. We even left a modest percentage of the initial sale in your personal checking account. Think of it as an early retirement fund. Use that pocket money to find yourself a quiet, small apartment somewhere far away from here. We have bulldozers scheduled to arrive on the first day of next month to clear the fields. This entire valley is going to be transformed into Nexterra's premier luxury eco-resort, and your quaint little farm is currently standing right in the middle of our future grand lobby." She leaned in close, resting her perfectly manicured hands flat on the table, invading my personal space with the overwhelming synthetic scent of her perfume. "It is strictly business, Sophie," Chloe whispered, her eyes completely devoid of empathy. "Do not make this harder than it needs to be." I kept my eyes locked entirely on the young man seated across the mahogany table. The suffocating weight of the room pressed against my chest, but my heart beat with a steady, terrifying rhythm. I searched Derek's face, desperately looking for the little boy I had carried on my hip, while I hauled heavy canvas bags of organic fertilizer in the blazing summer sun. I looked for the teenager whose college tuition I had funded by sacrificing my own sleep, working 80 hours a week in the laboratory until my hands were permanently stained with the potent botanical extracts that built this estate. I waited in the deafening silence for a real explanation, a sign of genuine remorse from the flesh and blood I had traded my absolute best years to nurture. Instead, Derek shifted awkwardly in his seat, utterly unable to meet my unwavering gaze. He cleared his throat, attempting to project a false sense of masculine authority that completely crumbled under the pathetic tremor in his voice. "Mom, you have to understand the reality of the situation," Derek began, his words tumbling out in a weak, defensive rush. "Nextera came to us with an offer we simply could not refuse. We are talking about tens of millions of dollars in immediate liquid assets. Do you have any idea what that kind of capital can do? It is going to allow Chloe and me to secure a luxury penthouse in New York and finally establish ourselves in the high society circles we belong in." He finally looked up, trying to force a reassuring smile that only made him look incredibly foolish. "And think about what this realistically means for you. I'm actually doing you a massive favor. This completely frees you from the exhausting manual labor you have been chained to for nearly 2 decades. You do not have to wake up at dawn anymore to check the crops. You do not have to worry about soil alkalinity or seasonal harvest quotas. You are finally free from all of it." Before the sheer absurdity of his justification could even settle in the heavy air, Chloe aggressively inserted herself into the conversation. She slammed her perfectly manicured hand flat onto the table, clearly irritated by my absolute lack of an emotional breakdown. "Honestly, Sophie, your entire attitude right now is incredibly ungrateful," Chloe snapped, her voice rising in sharp, indignant octaves. "We bent over backward to accommodate you in this corporate transition. We were generous enough to grant you a full 30 days to pack up your little botanical hobbies and leave gracefully. We could have easily called the county sheriff tonight to have you physically removed as a hostile trespasser on private corporate property. You should be thanking us for handling this as a family matter." I did not flinch at her ridiculous threats. As I sat there listening to their hollow, self-serving justifications, the very last fragile thread of maternal hope inside my chest quietly snapped. It was not a violent, messy tearing, but a silent, definitive dissolution. The devastating realization washed over me like freezing river water. The compassionate, honest boy I had raised was entirely gone. In his place sat a spineless puppet, a hollow shell of a man who had allowed his own character to be completely consumed by the blinding allure of sudden wealth and the ruthless manipulation of the woman sitting next to him. Chloe was visibly vibrating with dark anticipation. I could read the twisted, arrogant desire radiating from her rigid posture. She wanted a dramatic show. She desperately wanted me to scream, to shatter my crystal glass against the wall in a fit of rage, to collapse onto the hardwood floor and beg for mercy, weeping over the agonizing loss of my empire. She wanted the supreme satisfaction of completely breaking an independent woman she secretly envied and despised. But I had not built a multi-million-dollar corporation from the dirt up by succumbing to hysteria. The blinding, agonizing pain of a mother's heartbreak was instantly compartmentalized, sealed tightly away behind a towering, impenetrable fortress of cold business logic. I was no longer a mother looking at her son. I was a chief executive officer observing 2 extremely foolish thieves who had just walked blindly into a minefield. Moving with a deliberate, agonizing slowness, I picked up the eviction notice. I carefully aligned the edges of the heavy parchment, folding the document neatly in half and then in half again. I placed it perfectly parallel to the stem of my crystal champagne flute, making sure the paper was perfectly square with the edge of the table. Then I looked up. I let a slow, freezing smile spread across my face. It was a smile completely devoid of joy, a terrifying expression of absolute, unwavering control that instantly drained the arrogant color from Chloe's cheeks and made Derek physically recoil in his chair. "Tell me," I asked, my voice dropping to a calm, deadpan whisper that cut through the tension in the room like a surgical scalpel. "Before you confidently signed away my life's work for tens of millions of dollars, did either of you bother to carefully read the 7th clause in the Silver Pine County land zoning records and the intellectual property licenses?" The mention of a specific legal clause caused a momentary flicker of uncertainty in Chloe's eyes. It was a minuscule twitch of her perfectly sculpted eyebrows, a brief hesitation that exposed the fragile foundation of her supreme confidence. She quickly masked it with a harsh, dismissive scoff, crossing her arms even tighter as if to physically shield herself from the unexpected challenge. "Do not attempt to play amateur lawyer with me, Sophie," Chloe snapped, her tone dripping with venomous condescension. "Nextera Innovations employs an army of the most ruthless, highly paid corporate attorneys on the entire eastern seaboard. We ran an exhaustive due diligence process. The medical power of attorney Derek provided was ironclad, and the subsequent transfer of the primary deeds was perfectly executed under state law. There are absolutely no loopholes here." I did not argue. Arguing is what prey does when it is cornered. Instead, I gracefully pushed my chair back and stood up. The heavy silence returned to the dining room, broken only by the soft, rhythmic click of my heels against the hardwood floor as I walked purposefully toward the grand fireplace. Hanging above the mantel was a large, original oil painting depicting the Silver Pine Valley exactly as it looked a century ago. I reached out, grasped the heavy gilded frame, and swung it open to reveal a flush, stainless steel wall safe embedded deep within the stone. Derek let out a sharp gasp, clearly unaware that such a thing even existed in the house he grew up in. I quickly dialed the combination, turned the heavy latch, and retrieved a thick, heavily bound leather folder. I walked back to the dining table and dropped the folder right next to their pathetic eviction notice. The heavy thud resonated through the room like a gavel striking a judge's block. "Your highly paid attorneys might excel at corporate mergers," I said smoothly, unfastening the leather strap. "But they clearly failed to consult the local, county-level environmental archives. Let me enlighten you." I pulled out a stack of aged, yellowing documents. The unmistakable, deeply embossed seals of the Environmental Protection Agency and the United States Patent Office glared brightly under the chandelier light. Exactly 5 years ago, I realized how rapidly commercial developers were destroying the natural beauty of this state, I explained, maintaining a tone of absolute, chilling calmness. To permanently protect the fragile ecosystem of this specific valley, I placed the entirety of Cedar and Sage Estate into an irrevocable natural land conservation trust. Chloe narrowed her eyes, leaning forward slightly, her rigid corporate posture beginning to crack. "A trust does not prevent a legal sale if the sole authorized heir initiates it." "You are partially correct," I conceded with a razor-sharp smile. "However, the trust contains a highly specific poison pill covenant. This land can only be inherited or managed for the strict purpose of sustainable, organic agriculture. If the designated heir, or any entity they transfer the deed to, attempts any commercial transaction aimed at disrupting the agricultural structure of the soil, such as laying concrete foundations for an eco-resort, the ownership rights are instantly nullified." Derek's face drained of the tiny fraction of color it had left. "Nullified? What does that mean?" "It means," I said, locking my eyes directly onto my terrified son, "the moment you signed that contract with Nextera to build a resort, you automatically forfeited all your rights to the estate. The land does not belong to you, and it certainly does not belong to Nextera. By triggering that clause, the property is immediately seized by the Department of Forestry to be maintained as a protected state reserve. You sold them absolutely nothing." Chloe sprang up from her chair, her face flushing with a chaotic mix of intense rage and dawning panic. "That is a lie. We bought the company. We own the entire operational structure of Cedar and Sage." "Oh, you bought a company indeed," I chuckled, the sound completely devoid of any real humor. "But you see, Chloe, the company Derek transferred to you is nothing more than an operational shell. It pays the utility bills, manages the payroll for the farmhands, and owns a few aging tractors. That is it." I slid the second document across the polished mahogany wood, stopping it right at the tips of her trembling fingers. "The core value of my empire, the organic cosmetic formulas, the proprietary extraction methods, the exclusive trade secrets that are actually worth tens of millions of dollars, were never registered under the corporate umbrella. Every single one of those patents is registered under my sole, personal name. The company you just paid a fortune for has zero legal right to produce a single bottle of my serum." The terrifying reality of the situation finally slammed into Chloe. The arrogant, untouchable corporate shark was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate woman staring blindly into the abyss of her own ruined career. Her hands shook violently as she snatched her sleek mobile phone from the table. She frantically dialed a number, pressing the device so hard against her ear that her knuckles turned stark white. "Get me the head of legal right now!" she shrieked into the receiver, her voice completely losing its polished professional timbre, cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. The room descended into a tense, agonizing quiet as we listened to her desperate end of the conversation. I watched as she practically begged the person on the other end to run a secondary check on the localized trust databases and the national personal patent registries. The phone call lasted exactly 3 agonizing minutes. I watched the frantic, chaotic energy drain completely out of Chloe's body, replaced by the crushing weight of absolute, undeniable defeat. Nextera Innovations, a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate, had just realized they had blindly wired tens of millions of dollars to acquire a completely unbuildable piece of protected forest and an empty cosmetic shell company that did not actually own a single formula. Chloe's mouth opened and closed in silent horror. Her trembling fingers finally lost their grip. The expensive phone slipped from her hand, tumbling through the air and hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp, final crack that echoed the permanent shattering of their grand illusion. The silence that followed the sound of the shattering phone was brief, replaced instantly by an explosive volcanic eruption of fury. Chloe spun toward Derek, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The polished corporate persona had disintegrated, revealing the parasitic opportunist underneath. "You absolute pathetic fool!" Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking with jagged edges of panic and rage. She did not look at him with the affection of a fiancé, but with the disgust one reserves for a roach on the floor. "I trusted you to know your own mother's business. You told me the inheritance was absolute. You told me the papers were ironclad. You're the reason my career is currently incinerating." Derek shrank away from her, his hands raised instinctively to shield his face. But Chloe was relentless. She paced the room like a caged animal, her movements frantic and disjointed. The phone on the floor buzzed incessantly, a harsh, digital reminder of the nightmare they had triggered. Every time it vibrated, it seemed to vibrate with the terrifying authority of the corporate board. Chloe finally snatched it up, her fingers trembling so violently she almost dropped it again. She swiped the screen, putting it on speaker for a split second, and the furious, booming voice of a Nextera executive filled the room. "The board has reviewed the trust documentation, Chloe," the voice barked, cold and devoid of mercy. "You are terminated, effective immediately, for gross incompetence and failure to perform proper due diligence. Our legal team is already drafting the documents to file for fraud and breach of contract. Expect to be served with a lawsuit for tens of millions of dollars before the sun rises tomorrow. You and that boy are finished." The connection cut out with a sharp, final click. Chloe stared at the black screen for a moment, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. She did not attempt to negotiate or plead with the board. She knew exactly what kind of ruthless machinery she had been working for. She had helped build it, and now it was turning its gears to grind her into dust. Without uttering a single word of comfort to Derek, Chloe sprinted toward the hallway. I heard the frantic thudding of her heels as she ran up the stairs to their guest suite. A few minutes later, she returned, carrying a heavy designer suitcase. She did not even glance at Derek. She pulled the diamond engagement ring from her finger, walked over to him, and hurled it at his chest. It bounced off his sternum and skittered across the floor, settling into a dark corner. She marched to the front door, slammed it open, and left without a backward glance, choosing to save her own skin and sacrifice her partner to the wolves she had helped invite inside. Derek was left alone in the wreckage. The air in the room seemed to thin, making it difficult for him to breathe. The bravado he had worn like a costume all weekend dissolved, replaced by a raw, sniveling terror. He collapsed onto his knees, the polished hardwood floor digging into his skin. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving with ugly, unmanly sobs. He looked small, fragile, and utterly defeated. "Mom!" he choked out, his voice a pathetic broken rasp as he crawled toward me on his hands and knees, reaching out to grab the hem of my dress. "Mom, please, you have to help me. You are the only one who can undo the trust. You can call them, tell them it was all a mistake. Tell them to release the hold on the property. If you do that, I can clear this up. I can fix this, and we can go back to the way things were. Please, Mom, don't let them take me to jail for fraud. I didn't know it would turn out like this." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the young man who had been my entire world. My heart was a complex organ, and deep down, a part of me felt the sharp, stinging pang of maternal instinct, the agonizing urge to reach out and pull him into my arms, to shield him from the consequences of his own choices. That was the biological trap of motherhood, the instinct to protect one's offspring from any harm. But my rational mind, the mind of a woman who had spent 15 years fighting against the elements, against competitors, and against the crushing weight of the world to build my sanctuary, remained frozen and detached. If I reached out to save him now, I would only be feeding the monster of his own greed. He would never learn. He would never understand the value of honesty, integrity, or hard work. If I saved him, I would remain his hostage, and his behavior would only escalate until he finally destroyed everything I had ever built. I looked at him, not with malice, but with a profound, chilling clarity. I pulled my dress away from his grasp, stepping back so that he was left kneeling in the empty space between the table and the door. "Get up, Derek," I said, my voice steady, echoing with a finality that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the estate. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and red-rimmed, clinging to a thread of hope that I had already severed. "I am not going to call the trust," I said, my voice cold and hard as iron. "Every action you took, every document you signed, you did with the full intention of destroying my life for a payout. Now you must face the consequences of your own ambition. I am not your shield anymore, and I am certainly not the bank you can rob whenever you run out of money." I remembered the words Chloe had spoken only an hour ago, the cruel, rehearsed script of the corporate predator, and I realized they were the only words fitting for this moment. I looked down at my son, who was trembling on the floor, and I delivered the final, crushing blow. "Everything requires compliance with the law, my son. I have 30 days to move out, and I certainly do not have the time to resolve the catastrophic consequences of your greed. You created this mess, and you are going to be the one to clean it up." The crisp mountain air of Sunday morning felt remarkably cleaner than it had the day before. Shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning, 3 sleek black sedans and a Silver Pine County Sheriff cruiser pulled up my long gravel driveway. Representatives from the legal division of Nexterra stood silently by their vehicles, while 2 economic fraud detectives escorted Derek out of the front door. He was in handcuffs, his head hung low in utter disgrace, officially detained to face a massive investigation for grand-scale financial fraud. I stood on the wraparound cedar porch, my hands wrapped warmly around a steaming mug of black coffee. I watched calmly as the cruiser's tires kicked up pale dust, slowly disappearing behind the thick line of blue spruce trees. My eyes remained perfectly dry. There were absolutely no tears left to shed for a man who had willingly chosen greed over his own mother. My mobile phone vibrated in the pocket of my wool cardigan. It was my private attorney. "The eviction notice is entirely cancelled, Sophie," he announced with a warm tone of professional satisfaction. "Because Derek blatantly violated the core agricultural covenant of the trust, the temporary deed transfer is completely void. Full ownership of the estate has officially reverted back to you. You are the sole, permanent, and legal protector of the property." I thanked him and walked back inside the house. The living room still carried the sterile, corporate infection of Chloe's brief reign. Moving with deliberate, steady purpose, I gathered every glossy, cold accessory she had brought into my space and tossed them ruthlessly into a heavy trash bag. I unrolled my hand-woven rugs, repositioned the plush armchairs into their rightful, welcoming circle, and completely restored the warm, earthy soul of my sanctuary. Next, I dialed my production manager. "Fire up the main extraction line for the new botanical root formula," I ordered, my voice ringing with renewed authority. "We are heading into a brand new era, and we are ready to launch without any interference." Finally, I walked into the dining room and sat down on the comfortable sofa. I picked up the bottle of expensive champagne from yesterday's disastrous dinner and poured myself a fresh crystal flute. Taking a slow, deliberate sip, I let the crisp liquid cool my throat. At 45 years old, I realized this birthday had actually delivered the most magnificent gift I could have ever received. It gave me absolute freedom from the parasites attempting to drain my life and a priceless, permanent lesson. Never hand the key to your destiny to another living soul, not even your own flesh and blood. Thank you so much for listening to my story to the very end. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today, so please leave a note in the comments. If you found today's story engaging and satisfying, please consider helping our channel with just a $1 donation. You can easily support us by scanning the PayPal QR code right on your screen, or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the comments section. Your generosity allows us to pay our hardworking staff, helping them feed their families and continue creating the best revenge stories to serve our wonderful audience.